Well, I'm going to introduce the topic, and then I'm going to introduce the panelists. Um, we had a last minute cancellation, so we're lacking perspective from India. But we're talking today about digital public infrastructure. This has become a fashionable term. Somebody just told me that we should have called it AI digital public infrastructure because that's even more fashionable. But in fact, that is not a very scientific or accurate way of going about this. AI is a digital technology, and the infrastructure supporting digital services and applications, particularly payments, are something where we are bringing together new services in ways that raise policy issues regarded to security, trust, competition in the digital economy, and the role of government in the private sector. So we are going to first examine what we mean by DPI. Is this just another buzzword? Is it something real? We're going to talk about the institutional frameworks for collaboration between states and markets, oversight mechanisms, and the role of multi-stakeholder cooperation in fostering DPI production and governance. So what we're going to do is spend about 30 minutes on the stakeholder perspectives, that is to say, have the panelists talk, and then we want to have 45 minutes for debate and discussion, including our online audience and the local audience. Fully aware of the fact that our online audience will be probably having better sound than we have here. So let me introduce the panelists now. We have hovering above me on the screen is Ms. Jyoti Pandey. She's a regional director for the Internet Governance Project. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Milton Mueller. I'm with the Internet Governance Project too. I'm the director, and we're located at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Situated going from my right to my left is Luca Belli, and he's from Brazil. I can't remember the name of your institute.
FGV is the Center for Technology and Society at FGV Law School.
Yes, the well-known Center for Technology and Society, which goes by the acronym FGV, which nobody relates to, Technology
because FGV is the acronym of the foundation.
The foundation, right.
Fundação Getúlio Vargas. So
Right.
it's the Center for Technology and Society at FGV. That is right.
And then we have Ambassador Henri Verdier, who is from the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. Thanks for joining us. And we have online, we have David Magard, who's with the EU, there he is, Digital Identity Wallet Consortium and the Open Wallet Forum at the ITU. Welcome, David. And last but not least, we have Henriette Esterhuizen, a stalwart of civil society participation in these processes, and also the chair or the former chair of the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group. Are you still the chair? No. Okay. So let's get started. Let's begin with definitions and why you think this concept of digital public infrastructure has taken off and become such a buzzword. Let's begin with Jyoti.
Good morning, everyone. As Professor Mueller introduced me, I'm Jyoti Pandey. I work with him at the Internet Governance Project, and welcome to Emerging Norms for Digital Public Infrastructure. So the term digital public infrastructure, or DPI, as it's commonly referred to, is an approach or strategy for building large-scale networks, platforms, and services to mediate key processes or functionality that is essential for operating in the digital economy. So whether it's digital identity, paying for transactions, it encompasses the underlying design, the institutional frameworks, resources that enable the development and use of these large-scale systems. DPIs, as we know, are transforming the global economy. They're impacting business practices. They have altered relations between state, market, and citizens. The emergence of DPIs like identity and authentication, or interoperable payment systems have blurred the difference between public and private sector, traditional and new economies, tradable and non-tradable products, and between goods and services. They've also created avenues for development of norms and standards for cybersecurity, privacy, data protection, and competition. Issues such as domestic and cross-border flows of data, intellectual property rights, consumer and data protection, digital security are significantly impacted by the emergence of DPIs, and internet governance policies are also being shaped and advanced through DPIs. So as we know, this is a really important topic that everyone wants to weigh in on. But the fundamental issue is that even though we see forums like G20 and bilateral negotiations indicating that the adoption of DPIs are at a tipping point, they are being advanced globally, the lack of definition of consensus around what should be labeled as DPI and what doesn't fall within that label is missing at the moment. So our aim at this workshop is to have various folks who are part of stakeholder groups who are working and engaging with these processes to kind of shine some light and bring to our to increase and expand our understanding of how they are approaching building DPIs, how they are going about defining the values and infrastructure development and the design of these DPIs. The advancement of DPIs is happening even as legitimate concerns about their impact on trust, security, and competition in the digital economy remains unexplored or under addressed. There is a centralization of digital identity and online payments that is happening through under the DPI label. And this can lead to policy problems like exclusion, fraud, or even compromise of digital security. The rapid development and deployment also has profound implications in terms of disrupting traditional sectors and businesses. Another risk raised by DPIs, which are rooted in digital sovereignty or the claim that states have the stake in running the internet and digital services and should have the maximum say in how they are to be taken forward, is that it could lead to fragmentation. So a sovereignty-based approach to building and developing DPIs could lead to fragmentation, and we want to kind of explore this tension between fragmentation and cooperation that DPIs enable. Control of these institutional arrangements and the technical architecture of DPIs and its usage is creating discrete spaces of data and transactions, which can encourage and enable governments to pursue a sovereignty-based agenda. Delays in reform and rise in protectionism could hinder the adoption and expansion of DPI if embraced elsewhere. Given the stakes and the economic, political, social impact of DPIs, it is important to think through their development, create avenues for oversight. The prevailing discourse is exclusively focusing on legislative and regulatory measures. However, interventions such as audits and assessments could also play a vital role. So, like Professor Mueller kind of directed, that we will delve into these other issues as we go by in this discussion. But on definition itself, we do have certain global forums that are trying to create the platform and bring together diverse stakeholders to come towards a common definition. But again, because of this sovereignty-based approach to developing DPIs, the consensus has not been easy to come by. And that's what we are hoping to kind of delve into more over here. I'm happy to jump in and talk more about it, but I want to hear from my other panelists. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jyoti. People hear me? All right. So why don't we go next to David? The ITU has played a classical role in basic telecommunications infrastructure coordination. They have never really built infrastructure. They're telling me my mic is not working again.
You want to borrow mine?
Oh, yeah. Okay, you have to turn it on. Somehow it got turned off. So, yes, let's turn to David. And can you give us a brief overview, 5 minutes or so, of what your perspective is, particularly focusing on the definitional issues at this stage?
I can give it a try. So thank you everyone for inviting me to this panel. sit in a kind of cold Sweden now. I work for the Swedish Companies Registration Office under the Ministry of Economic Affairs in Sweden. And also am the coordinator of EWC, the wallet consortia. We pilot digital identity wallets for Europe. This is a collaborative effort, 86 organizations from private and public sector, done over 2 years, 20 million euros, rather big, and I guess in some sense a digital public infrastructure, although this is not really my area of expertise, so I'm coming with a kind of perspective from what I don't understand of the public infrastructure, and see if that can add to the discussion. When it comes to digital public infrastructures and what we see from at least what I see, and I've been working with the Swedish government, within the Swedish government, for about 10 years with digitalization, and of course in the EU as well. I'm part of several expert groups and also the Open Wallet Forum, and some other OECD groups and so on before. Digital public infrastructures kind of come in my view, the last 3 years. I wouldn't say that this is a big discussion in the EU. I haven't really used it at all, to be honest, in the work that we've done. And it's not something that is really looked at from my perspective when it comes to digital identity ecosystem in the EU. So I think this is interesting for the discussion, because then it seems like we have different kind of angles to it and different understandings, and also of course that makes it difficult to come with a kind of cohesive understanding of the digital public infrastructure and what we should do with it. From my perspective, also speaking about EU and also about Sweden, this is my personal understanding though, but digital sovereignty is a core focus of the EU in our digital strategies. I wouldn't say that necessarily hinders cooperation with the private sector or other countries, but there is an understanding that we need to some degree have we need to somehow have control of some of the key fundamental infrastructures when it comes to digitalization, such as digital identity. Although we have a lot of good experience with private.
We have a lot of ambient noise.
Should I stop or?
You can go on, but we have a lot of ambient noise here.
Okay. Yeah. And yes, to kind of finish up, then I think what's mostly interesting, where I kind of sit, is the interoperability between identity systems and interoperability, of course, on the technological infrastructure layers, but also, of course, the semantics, so legal semantics and definitions and so on. So I'm kind of curious on kind of the interoperability questions in the digital public infrastructure framework, which, as far as I've seen, it's not that prominent in kind of the discussion papers and so on that I've browsed through the last years.
Good,
So,
thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's interesting then that from the perspective of, from David's perspective, the term is not commonly used, and the whatever main concern he has is in fact with interoperability, which, as Jyoti flagged, may be an issue if you start taking a sovereigntist approach to DPI. So let's go on to Ambassador Verdier. I think you are more involved with this topic.
Yeah, I am. So, first, let's say that I'm a veteran of the internet revolution. I started my first company in 1995, and then I became an ambassador. And I say this because that's always the same thing. The reality is vibrant, evolving, diverse, complex, and we look for words. But the reality doesn't obey to our words. I say this because the DPI movement is one new word for various approaches, and you can connect it to infrastructures, to public service, to sometimes commons, to platform strategies. And for example, personally, I discovered probably those kind of ideas 15 years ago. I was writing a book on platform strategies, and I was trying to explain the success and the strength of the big platforms like Google or Facebook or Apple itself. And suddenly I discovered that some people were speaking about government as a platform. And I was very interested by this approach. And when I became the French head of the French IT department for the government, I tried to develop some building blocks for a government as a platform strategy. And we did develop France Connect or some important APIs. And it was on a certain perspective, a kind of prototype of what we call now DPI. And I've discovered at this time the Estonian X Road, for example, that is another kind of ancestor of the DPI approach. And then I discovered what was happening in India. So Pramod is not with us today, but we can here observe a massive impact because in less than 3 years, they did develop a digital ID for more than 1 billion people, and 25% of them didn't even have a legal existence, and then they had a legal existence plus an ID. Then they did develop a very smart payment interface. But that is just, just a set of API. They did just decide that the banks has to be able to receive payment orders through this format, and they have the duty to agree to execute payments through this format. That's all. Plus, independent body to regulate, to be sure that the banks are correctly implementing the system. And thanks to this approach, a good definition of a set of APIs, they did manage to let the market conceive 600 payment systems. So of course, Alipay and Google Pay are the biggest, but there is a huge diversity of payment system. You can pay with a QR code or with WhatsApp, or it depends of your service. So I mentioned this to say that a lot of people a lot of countries or organizations are trying to build this small layer of something, a kind of platformization between the free internet and the market and the society. And that's very important because as I said, usually in the digital world, platform strategies are very efficient. A platform strategy is a strategy that compacts and distributes some resources for users. Most often they try to take a part of the added value of the users. So they take the platforms, the private platforms, they take data, or they try to capture you, or they ask for revenue sharing. But that's efficient. A very simple and obvious platform strategy is a smartphone itself. If you are a service developer, you are very grateful to Apple or Google to propose to you a connected computer with a camera and a connection and Meteo and a lot of sensors and a lot of tools, plus the good SDK. So you are very grateful and you agree to share 30% of your revenues because they did allow you to innovate and create and try to access to the market. So that's efficient and that can be dangerous, that was said, because of course the platform is controlling everything. But to conclude this introduction, from my perspective, the most important reason to speak about this here in the IGF is that if we want to protect a free, open, decentralized, neutral, and unified internet, and if we want to avoid the capture of this internet by strong companies that are built on the internet and that try to capture the customer, and if we want to remain free democracies. So we have a fundamental right. For example, we are in Europe, we are very attached to privacy. We have a fundamental right to say we want to protect privacy, or we are not democracies anymore. So we have to impose some views to the companies that are built on the internet. So if you want to manage all of this, to protect the free and open and decentralized internet, to avoid the capture by strong actors, to build a democratic feedback, probably the design of this small layer of public services to build the interface between all those principles is a very, very good and efficient approach. But of course, and it will be said, I think, you can also have a public infrastructure that is dangerous. You can have a public infrastructure that is too much owned or controlled by the government itself, that is not transparent enough, that is, or that make mistakes with a security breach, or I don't know. So we have to design it carefully in a multi-stakeholder way with enough transparency, if enough democratic feedback. But I don't see any other approach than this layer of public service if we don't want the internet to become a kind of new Far West. So that's my view to launch the conversation.
Very good. So you have introduced something that I think is the best definition of DPI that I've heard, which is a set of APIs that is serving as an intermediary for or a platform for many different, particularly as an interface between government services and the broader public. Let's turn to Luca, who has, I think, some very strong perspectives on DPI based on your experience in Brazil.
Not very strong. I would not say strong, but so just to provide a little bit of context. So at FGV, I'm professor at FGV Law School, and besides directing the Center for Technology and Society at FGV, as Milton eloquently was announcing, I also direct a project called Cyber BRICS that maps and compares the digital policies of the BRICS grouping. So over the past 5 years, we have discussed a lot of issues, and one of them is also amongst data governance and digital transformation, AI governance, an overlapping issue is digital sovereignty. So we have a book that should already be available in open access on the Cambridge University Press website on digital sovereignty in the BRICS. And some of the case studies we have analyzed from India or Brazil are precisely about DPIs and how they can be considered as an example of good digital sovereignty in some cases. Again, I also want to introduce a little bit of caution because DPI as digital sovereignty, as pretty much anything we can speak in life, it may be a label. So to understand if it is good or bad, we have to understand what is the content behind the label, right? So DPI as a definition, the only agreed international definition we have of DPIs has been put forward by the G20 last year under the Indian presidency and has been taken off by the UN. For instance, if you look at the reports recent on DPI safeguards done by the DPI and UNDP, you will see that they quote the same definition of the G20 last year under the Indian presidency. And again, the Indians have been very successful because the DPIs for them is a key of their digital transformation strategy that's endured more than 10 years under the India Stack program. So let's say that the cherry on top of their strategy was to put this into the G20 so that everyone now is speaking about DPIs, which is a very successful strategy. And very few countries have been this strategy and this agenda for G20, in my opinion. And so this definition is considering DPIs as digital systems that should be secure and interoperable, and that they're used to provide access to public or private services and deliver, therefore, not only public services, although they are mainly used for public services. But if you look at India, there is a very good example of the ONDC, the Open Network for Digital Commerce, which is a protocol for a great bazaar where any kind of private service can be delivered. So it's not only about public services. We usually we categorize DPIs as digital identities, online payments, and personal data consent managers. This could be could fit into the public services, especially the first two. But they are not only public services; they can be used for private services. And another good example, also to stress that this does not only happen at the federal level, at the national level. In the city where I live, Rio de Janeiro, there is a very good competitor of Uber called Taxi Rio. It's a DPI made by the local municipality that allows you to take taxis without using Uber, and is entirely developed by the local administration. So it's a very good example of how DPIs can also be local, and also how, why we speak about digital sovereignty, not only as something that is state-driven, but can be driven by local communities, local municipalities, even local individuals. And why I argue that DPIs like PIX, our national digital payment infrastructure, is a good example of digital sovereignty, because it allows in this case, the individuals and the government to understand how the technology work, develop it, and regulate it effectively, which is how we define digital sovereignty in the book, in its various nuances. It's all about understanding, developing and regulating effectively technology. And so before PIX, our national payment infrastructure, was developed, the only exclusive way to process digital payments in Brazil was through Visa and MasterCard. The only way was using two foreign companies that not only charge extortionary fees between 3 and 5% in all the global south, but also few people understand that over the past 10 years, they became big data companies. Most of their revenues is not the 3 to 5% of the fee, is the intelligence and profiling they elaborate on data collection of every single consumer that uses. People don't understand it when they use their credit card. They are de facto not only paying with money, they are paying with data. And the only ones that were reaping these benefits were Visa and MasterCard before PIX in Brazil or UPI in India. So this is a very good example, in my opinion, of how DPI can be leveraged for good digital sovereignty, because it broke the monopoly, actually the duopoly of Visa and MasterCard. The antitrust and competition authorities could have cried and adopted any kind of remedy. They would have never broken this monopoly, never. This has created an alternative that has reverted automatically 3 to 5% of what consumers pay in their pocket. So enormous advancement in terms of competition and consumer benefit. An enormous advancement in terms of informational self-determination or data protection. People now understand that their data are collected and who is collecting them, because the online banking intermediaries they have terms of service and they precisely state what they do. When you use a credit card, you don't even know that your data are collected. So that is an enormous advancement in terms of informational self-determination. And also, to conclude, this has also provided a very good example of how multi-stakeholder cooperation is not only about speaking in nice fora, but it also can be very outcome-oriented and very effective. The Brazilian Central Bank, which is one of the few institutions in Brazil, works very well, has leveraged a lot of public consultation with stakeholders to build PIX, is still working with all financial intermediaries to implement it, and created something called PIX Forum, which is not a nice event, but is a process to collect continuous feedback from those who are implementing the technology, to understand how to improve it and what are the pitfalls of the technology. So I think that there are a lot of very good examples here. I would also provide, do I have a last minute?
One more minute, yes, please.
Meaningful connectivity. This has also explained the value of meaningful connectivity. In India, UPI, the Uniform Payment Infrastructure from which PIX is inspired, was a success only because India in 2016 adopted net neutrality rules that prohibited zero rating. So if you have meaningful connectivity, you can use DPIs. If you, as in all the global south, only access the internet through Meta family of apps, primarily WhatsApp and in some cases Facebook and Instagram, you cannot have access to DPIs because you pay for them. You pay for access to connectivity. So the reason why India is experiencing a belle epoque of innovation is because they prohibited zero rating in 2016, but for the same reason, that is actually paradoxically the same reason why PIX has been a success in Brazil, because when it was going to enter in force in 2020, 1 month before, WhatsApp was introducing WhatsApp payment. And the Brazilian Central Bank know very well that if WhatsApp payment during the pandemic had been introduced before PIX, no one here would be celebrating PIX as a success story, but everyone in Brazil would be using WhatsApp payment. So they suspended the entrance in force of WhatsApp payment until PIX was also in force for consumers. Just makes in Brazil, only because the Brazilian Central Bank in 2020 understood that if they had allowed WhatsApp payment to enter in force before Pix, Pix would have been absolutely useless. So before, I think this is a very cautionary tale for all governments willing to do DPIs. Think about systemically about everything, because if you spend a lot of money to do the best possible DPI, but at the end of the day, everyone only access WhatsApp and Facebook, it's useless to put your investment in DPIs.
Okay, so now you understand why I said Luca had strong opinions about DPI. Let's go on to Henriette.
DPIs or many things.
Yes.
Just before, if I can add one word to make it even more simple. One day I was discussing with Pramod Verma, who was supposed to be there today, and he told me this very simple idea. He told me, you, in Europe, you did build your strengths and prosperity and maybe sovereignty thanks to public infrastructure, roads, trains, bridges, and you became very prosperous. And then suddenly you did stop. And today, in the current economy, you need ID, payment, geolocalization. That are the infrastructure of the 21st century.
Thanks, Ambas. Milton, do I also have strong feelings? Actually, I do. I think that DPI is a really important opportunity for us to fill gaps that date back. I mean, I see the ancestors of DPI, and I'm speaking very much from an African perspective. I'm in South Africa, but I work across the continent. Firstly, open government. One of those grand ideas and grand coalitions from about 20 years ago, which still exists, but it's lost its glamour, it's lost its attraction. And then the World Summit on the Information Society, where you had action lines on e-government, e-health, e-education, an enabling environment for innovation, all of those elements that were part of and of course, connectivity infrastructure. And what we have as a result of that 20 years later is a landscape that's completely characterized by digital inequality, which means that any initiative, be it a health initiative or an education initiative, or a government initiative, actually, in most cases, just increases that inequality, because if there isn't connectivity across the board, if people don't have the devices, if people in rural areas cannot afford the cost of mobile broadband, then any investment in any kind of digital public service, or in fact, even in other services, commercial services, tends to just increase the gap between those who have and who can benefit and those who don't. I think I'm not surprised that David hasn't heard much about digital public infrastructure in Sweden, because you have digital public infrastructure in Sweden. You don't need to talk about it, but we need to talk about it, and we need to talk about it very seriously. And I don't think, Milton, it's a set of APIs. It's much, much more than that. I think the G20 definition, or looking at these 4 elements of broadband infrastructure, absolutely critical in Africa. I'm not sure how many people are aware that internet penetration in Africa is actually lower now than it was a few years ago. It's now below 40%. It was around 40. It's now more in the upper 30s. Even access to electricity is reducing in parts of Africa where dependency on hydro is affected by drought. Digital identity systems, again, even identity systems are a challenge in many African countries. And then, of course, the challenge of moving to digital identity, when the data governance and the data protection frameworks and the public administration and rights protection frameworks are also insufficient in many cases. Another challenge, finance payments. How do most Africans have financial inclusion or any semblance of it? It's through Safaricom, it's through mobile operators facilitating quite expensive financial services for the poor. Very few countries in Africa outside of Nigeria and South Africa, for example, have banking that actually makes is accessible to the poor.
So let me just be clear here, Henriette. You are broadening the concept of infrastructure to everything: electricity, telecoms, banking, the whole schmear.
Well, the G20 definition of digital public infrastructure looks at data, finance, broadband infrastructure, and identity. And I think for all of those aspects to be able to be implemented and operated and to become a platform for developing public services, you need not just the broadband, you also need the electricity infrastructure. Why I think it's important and why DPI is such a good opportunity is because I think it, I mean, Luca talked a lot about how it can facilitate multi-stakeholder cooperation. That's absolutely true. But I think even at a national level, it can facilitate intergovernmental collaboration. It can facilitate initiatives such as laying out broadband backbone, which is often done by the Ministry of Communications, with the Ministry of Finance, the Department of Finance, who's trying to deal with financial inclusion, with Home Affairs, that's trying to deal with digital identity systems. A country like South Africa, for example, pays social grants. In fact, the only reason people in South Africa don't starve is because they get grants from the government. Administering that has been a massive challenge because there is no infrastructure to do that easily. It has been done in collaboration with the private sector, but it is extremely complex. And
well, I just think that I think I need to keep us a bit more focused here, because if you're talking about the development of telecommunications or broadband infrastructure, right? There is a completely different set of institutions and processes that have facilitated the growth of that. For example, all of these countries that had state-owned telecom monopolies had abysmal levels of penetration before liberalization and competition was introduced in the 90s or 2000s, right? You have to admit that there was public infrastructure, and whether it's power or especially telecoms, these countries that relied entirely on the state to be the developer or on international grants are simply never going to catch up with what was happening in the world where there was commercial development.
so, Milton, what I'm saying is that DPI is an opportunity for countries where that gap exists to fill it.
But with what capital, with what investment, where does the money come?
That is why it's an important discussion. And that's why it's important that we discuss it in the context of the IGF and WSIS, because financing that investment and having private and public partnerships and having the kind of rights protections that needs to be built into that is something that we can try and achieve through the WSIS, through the South African chairing of the G20. So I know that Ayoti wants to speak about it. The fact that it's public infrastructure doesn't mean that it has to be developed and owned and controlled by the state. It means that it has to be developed and controlled and regulated in the public interest. I'm not suggesting the statist approach.
Let me go again, and then she's been jumping up.
So these are really interesting perspectives, but I just want to, as the token representative of India and living through this great digital public infrastructure revolution, I feel like I have to chime in a little bit, going back into the history of how did the label DPI come about. Henriette is very correct that the roots of this lie in the e-governance, the digitization initiatives that have kind of evolved with time and investment and stakeholder priorities. So it's running along the same trajectory. But for example, digital identity is rooted in the notion of national security, and therefore the state has way more say in running digital identity within the India stack than it has in matters of UPI, which has been developed by banks coming together to compete against MasterCard and Visa. So even within this whole label of India Stack, which later got reformulated as DPI as they wanted to export it to other countries, the idea of digital identity is coming from a different perspective. Digital payments and wallets are coming from a different priority and perspective, and digital sovereignty seems to be the thread that ties these two different efforts and neatly brings them together under a common label and therefore facilitates adoption, etc. I want to throw in a couple of questions here for everyone's consideration. I like what Ambassador talked about, where he's like your intention versus your experience there can be a huge gap between that. So for example, when we talk about DPI and digital identity in India, one of the most common refrains I hear from everyone is that look at the scale and look at how many people have digital identity. And these were people, the large parts of the population were lacking any form of legal identity. Firstly, that claim is very, very contested. There were various forms of identity available to the population. But of course, the state apparatus was backing this digital identity project. And therefore, one of the rationales to push it forward was to make the claim that people lack identity and therefore need a digital version of that identity to upgrade the population and bring them into the modern world, into this revolution, right? But also, I want to ask that after the digital identity got built, it got integrated into welfare, not because this was strategic from day one, because the government and the players who were developing digital identity realized that the swiftest way of ensuring adoption and achieving that scale would be to integrate it with welfare schemes, because the state has greater control over it and therefore would be able to push and apply its might behind the adoption of these services. So again, the intention, how has it reached that scale, and is the scale the only parameter of success? And I think this is what Henriette is referring to when she talks about that we can't only look at the scale and then reach and let's talk about roads, like, right? All countries have roads, but in some countries the roads are excellent and talked about globally, but in other countries they're not that well developed. Some villages and towns in India still have dirt tracks that are referred to as roads, right? Who is responsible for building roads? It can happen both through public funding, it can happen through public-private cooperation, or private sector can be contracted to build roads. But it's not just building roads once. Roads require maintenance. Roads will have to be upgraded as traffic piles up. Different aspects need to be considered as the use of the road evolves. And I feel in a lot of these discussions about DPI, we get stuck at pointing to the success in India and not delving deep into that. Fine, no matter what the justification as to why this label has become really popular, but what are the impacts of DPI on the ground? What is the reality of the people who are actually engaging and interacting with these public infrastructure, and how public are they? So for example, the UPI API is owned by the consortium of Indian banks, and they developed the API before, and they actually kind of didn't allow WhatsApp to launch its payment or delayed, WhatsApp adopting the protocol that was developed for interoperable payments in India. So if the idea of digital public infrastructure is that it is an alternative to big tech monopolistic structures that are very prevalent in the digital ecosystem currently, are we replacing one monopoly with another kind of monopoly? And I would really want to hear more about these themes from our panelists.
Okay.
You want to react to Yorti, please, Milton. I agree 100% with you. And this workshop is about norms. And I think I've looked at quite a lot of DPI norms, the UNDP, safety guidelines, whatever they're called. And I think none of them mention what you've just talked about is how do you maintain these roads? How do you assess whether they're getting to the people that need them most, and whether those people are actually able to find buses that they can ride on those roads to get where they need to. I haven't seen that level of practical looking at the sustainability and the impact of DPI initiatives. And in fact, I think if we don't reframe how we talk about DPI, it's just going to become another opportunity for vendor-driven pseudo-public investment taken advantage of by corporations that are set up to do that, as has been the case with e-education, the WSIS action line.
But that's why I want to come. So I want to connect some dots. First, your former question. I think that's of the utmost importance to understand what has what must be mutualized. And the difference between you said sometimes the public telecommunication did not reach out so much. The growing consensus within the community of DPI's builders is that we must find what has to be done with this kind of public service approach and what must be led to the market.
Mhm.
So most of the DPI's architects, they are looking for the minimum necessary infrastructure, if I may. And for example, in India, they don't make UPI doesn't make the payment systems. They have more than 600
Right.
private payment systems,
Exactly.
but built on a common infrastructure.
So
and that's
right.
much more efficient. Same for roads. The importance is to have an interoperable road systems. I cannot change my car because I'm entering on another private road. So I need to be able to drive everywhere. If some of those roads are highway and I have to pay because this is a very expensive highway and others are communal small streets, doesn't matter. The important is to have one unified system. And that's the beauty of the DPI movement. We are looking for, yes, what must be done as a common and clear and infrastructure for the market,
Right,
to allow the market.
I think this is a well-known, although not frequently acknowledged. We tend to have this polarity, more government, more market. The fact of the matter is that markets function well when they have the right commons in which all the market players can interact.
And maybe just one last thing. For most European, when you say public services, you call lawyers too, because there is a long tradition of juridical definition of what must be a public service. A public service has to be neutral, equal access. You have the duty to maintain it. You cannot change your mind and say, oh, sorry, I stopped this project. There are very clear and strong definitions of public service. It can be done through private sector or not. It can be free or not, but there are some specific duties. And a public service, at least in Europe, it might be public, it can be state-owned, but public servants are not governments. And they have, for example, the right to contest the authorities because they obey to the definition of their public service.
In some countries, that is true.
Some countries.
Luca, you're dying to get in here.
Yeah, I wanted to first to attract everyone's attention to a rare moment of agreement between me and Milton, because I think I concur with Milton in the fact that I think it is better to keep separate the distinction between digital public infrastructure and classic infrastructure. Because when we speak about DPIs, it's about digital systems built on open standards that are interoperable and secure to provide service. We might include into this telecom infrastructure, but I think it's an overstretch. I would keep it to software rather than getting into hardware. Having said that, as I was mentioning in the very beginning of my remarks, I think one really has not only to think that DPI, although there is this nice internationally agreed definition, there are very different implementation of the concept, and it's essential to study the details. Of course, in this panel, we can only have a superficial discussion about it, but if one study, let me provide some key examples between India and Brazil on the very same type of digital public infrastructure for payments to illustrate how this can be radically different. I think that the Brazilian experiment with PIX has been an evolution of what has been copied de facto from the UPI in India, and actually maybe the Indians will not disclose that they have copied this from Russia, because Russia introduced its system MIR after the invasion of Crimea in 2014, when it was sanctioned immediately the day after by the US with the prohibition of Visa and MasterCard. So from night to day, Russians could not pay anything with their cards, so they had to come up with a new system, and a domestic one, MIR, like the space station MIR, but it was a very old system based on cards, so a physical system. Now they have copied Brazil and India, and they also have a digital public infrastructure, a software one. But the origin were the Russians that developed this for an existential reasons. From night to day, you don't have an online payment, so you have to come up with a solution. And the Indians were thinking about this and were like, you know what? They at the same time they have disrupted Visa and MasterCard duopoly, so let's do it. But the way in which the Indian did it, as Jyoti was mentioning, was to create a non-for-profit corporation. So probably because they were skeptical about bureaucrats being able to do this, so they created the Reserve Bank of India, together with the main financial intermediary, created this National Payment Corporation of India. It's like an icon for payments. And they did the digital public infrastructure. They created the UPI. But if the reason why I argue that actually the Brazilian experiment went further, because in my opinion, is much more transparent and accountable, is that the Brazilian experiment was directed by the Brazilian Central Bank. It's a public institution. So if I file a request of access to information to the Brazilian Central Bank and I ask them, tell me which data you have about me, tell me with whom you share them, tell me which are the cybersecurity standard that you adopted, yet they are obliged to reply to me. And if they don't reply to me, I sue them. If I file this same kind of request for access information to the National Payment Corporation of India, they reply to me, I'm sorry, we are not a public institution. We have no duty to reply to you. And we can keep everything totally opaque as much as we want, because this is not a public institution. So, of course, this could be changed in India if the National Payment Corporation of India became a public institution, and so they would be obliged to be more accountable. Not in data protection terms, because those who know the digital data protection, Personal Data Protection Act of India know very well that all public institutions are exempted from respecting the data protection law of India. So even if it was a public institution, would not be bound by respecting data protection law, because data protection law in India has carved out an enormous exception for all public institutions. But that is the reason why I argue that we really should look at the details of these things, because calling something digital public infrastructure doesn't make it good or bad.
Very good.
We have now Bill Gates blogging about digital public infrastructure, because of course this is a fashionable concept, has been co-opted by Microsoft, as usually happens with all nice concepts. Last year at IGF we were speaking about AI sovereignty. We released a book last year about this, and 2 months after Nvidia and Oracle started to blog about how their products were excellent for AI sovereignty, which I think is a little bit of overstretch of the concept, because of course they argue that you can be AI sovereign if you buy their tools, which is again a little bit of overstretch of the concept. But again, we really have not only to look at the label, but what is behind the label, to understand if we can form our opinion and to understand if it is good or bad.
Good. I need to get in here. So I really appreciated your story about the competition issue related to Visa and MasterCard in Brazil. I would tell you that within the US, this is recognized as a competition issue, but you need to understand how deeply embedded the dominance of those two payment networks is in our system of banking regulation. In other words, in some ways, the regulatory system has created conditions which lead to an oligopoly. And one of the concerns I have with this notion of sovereignty when it comes to DPI is that you could very easily recreate that situation in which local actors within a state, essentially, if the DPI is not open and not standardized in a way that is facilitating competition, it can very easily lead to a recreation of national oligopolies or national monopolies. And one of the big competitors to a new emerging form of DPI, i.e. cryptocurrency, are of course the central banks. And so this is a very clear contradiction or a clash between a sovereignty-based payment system and monetary system and a globalized one facilitated by the internet. The other point I'd like to make here is that when we talk about interoperability and commons versus market, it seems that we're not fully recognizing the revolutionary impact of the internet itself. Right? What is the internet? It's a set of non-proprietary protocols, right? A non-proprietary protocols that made all of this connectivity possible, and it essentially facilitated a digitally networked economy, right? And so it wasn't like the government said, we're going to create a globally integrated economy, and that's why we're funding this protocol. It was simply they The protocol was created through computer scientists and researchers, and then it was, because it was non-proprietary, which was a good part about the fact that the government funded it, but it was non-proprietary, so that neither the US government nor any private actor controlled the use and development of the infrastructure around the internet. And one of the things we can even talk about digital payments now coming down to our phones is because of this commons, this digital commons created by the internet protocols.
In 3 words, so you're right, internet is based on open standards and we have to protect it. But we have also to recognize that internet is captured because of through ID, payment, and some things like this. So DPI could be an answer, but you're right too. Maybe we should start thinking about a kind of ITU for DPIs, because interoperability, free exchange of, so I should be able to use my European digital wallet in India. That should be the goal. I should be able to travel, to exchange, with my coming from my DPI and negotiating with others.
Just to complement your point, because there is already an ITU for DPI, which is the ITU, because it has already released 2 years ago the Gov Stack, which is a set of open protocols for DPIs. But what is the problem with the ITU? The ITU, as it is an intergovernmental organization that sets norms. The reasoning behind the DPI is building the infrastructure. Is not only I honestly use this in class with students as an example of what Lessig called 25 years ago regulation by architecture, because it is not, you are not regulating the market by imposing a sanction or by defining a norm. You are regulating the market by creating an infrastructure, an architecture that competes with what exists. And you're perfectly right. I mean, both of you are right. You are right because the internet is based on, is probably the only part of the internet that is public, is the protocols, because public
commons,
public, exactly,
commons.
But you are right. But on that public infrastructure, leading US big tech as concentrated dominance. And so the need for DPIs now is to revert this concentration. It is evident, it's quite blatant. And that is why I think that DPIs are, they could be seen, again, once again, word of caution. DPI is not always good or not always bad, but some of the examples could be seen as very good examples to reclaim digital sovereignty. So to reclaim the capability to understand how the technology functions, develop it, and regulate it effectively, which is something that we have, pretty much everyone has lost over the past 20 decades, because how the internet is now regulated is not through our nice laws. I say this with enormous frustration as a lawyer. The way in which the internet is regulated is not the law that I teach to students. I tell them this is one vector of regulation. Reed Lessig, he was mentioning this 25 years ago, is one of the vectors. Is much more effective through regulate through infrastructure, what Lessig called architecture, but it de facto is what Susan Strange called structural power 30 years ago. Or through market incentives, through subsidies and taxation. Why do everyone uses WhatsApp for all communications in the global south? Because it's considered as free. It's a market incentive. If WhatsApp had to be paid $100 per month, no one would use it in the global south. But the way we communicate is regulated by a subsidy that
like most of the infrastructure is actually created privately. I mean, the telecom infrastructure, the power infrastructure, it's all. Let me get David in here, see if he has anything to say. At this point, we've kind of left him in the dust.
No, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. So I have two things that I would like to just put on the table. So one maybe interesting fact is from Sweden then. So we have we're using Bank ID, which is digital identity made by the corporation of the big banks in Sweden. It's used by 99.7% of the Swedish adult population, so that is 18 to 67. So it's of course very successful when it comes to usage and adoption. But now the last 3 years we have started work for a government issued identity, because we kind of seen that giving away all of the control of the digital identity also creates some issues. Those could be kind of on the kind of security, but also inclusion, and also the development actually of infrastructures, because then we are from the public side then in the hands of Bank ID, which is sometimes good because we have a good cooperation, but sometimes it also stifles us a bit. So in my mind, that says that it's not, every situation is different, so it's not possible to kind of have a framework that you kind of adopt to one country. It will differ. Yeah.
Okay,
Due to the fact where you're coming from. Yeah.
So I'll like to hear more about this Bank ID offline. But
yeah,
let's
the second part
now.
is I was want to say the second part is what we're doing in EU now with the wallets is that we actually regulate open source, open standards for digital identity, and I think that the digital infrastructures, public infrastructure, if you want to call them that, it's the trigger is really when you kind of make it cross-border. Because then you need the interoperability, you need the kind of guardrails and the railroads and all of these things kind of working. And it's really, really hard to do that, even with standardization. We can see that we're different standards and so on. But what we're seeing now in the EU is the regulation of it, and it comes from a open source kind of idea. So I think that is very promising for making these things that you're speaking about being the kind of digital commons and the possibility to for everyone to kind of have the same set of infrastructure and standards and so on. Yeah.
Okay. I think we're supposed to end at 10:45, so I'm going to ask now for all of you, starting with Jyoti, to provide some wrap-up comments. And I want you to focus in particular on what action items you think the global community should take with respect to this issue. What can we do globally? And Henriette, I will not allow you to say that we should suddenly magically appear with $7 trillion to build broadband infrastructure everywhere. I'm going to have to ask you where that money comes from. But in terms of real feasible action items, what should we do next? Let's start with Jyoti.
So before I come into the action items, just briefly, one big takeaway for me from this conversation, and it's also a question, is that which digital services qualify for the label of digital public infrastructure? Is social media DPI? Is digital identity DPI? What are the values that actually translate into something being labeled as DPI? Does it have to be open standard? Does it have to be public funded for the public part of the public infrastructure to hold? Also, I think another big point of confusion here is that the term infrastructure or architecture, as Luca helpfully referred to, has a certain notion that is already there is a common ground around these ideas, right? What is happening in the case of India Stack specifically, and maybe DPI more broadly, is that software and applications are being relabeled as infrastructure. And this is a very problematic pathway in my view, because as your digitization and your growth of your digital economy goals keep shifting, you can't keep relabeling things that are agreed upon to suit your strategy and your convenience and to propel you into the global conversation on regulating the internet and digital services. It is a very effective strategy, but it causes confusion, and it will lead to exactly this kind of fragmentation where everybody in various jurisdictions, stakeholders that have a stake or are behind certain projects, see the benefit of labeling their projects as DPI to attract more funding, to attract more mileage, to attract more attention. And we need to be wary of that. In terms of action points that we really need to focus on, I think, unpacking these terms. Are all digital services DPI? What values constitute as public of the DPI label, and what can applications and software become infrastructure? what are the infrastructural dimensions? So can you make digital identity, the Indian digital identity, Aadhaar, mandatory for me to engage or access services on the internet? Right now in India, Aadhaar's use by the Supreme Court intervention has been restricted to services that have been paid for by the public fund of India, so our taxpayers' money. But even though that decision is being completely flouted by stakeholders in both private sector and public sector in India, because they see the benefit of pushing digital identity adoption to achieve that scale. So I think drawing the guardrails and working closer to a more narrow, value-driven, precise definition is going to take this in a much more productive direction than the confusion that is currently informing our discussions everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. Let's start with Andrea and then just go around the circle, ending with David.
Thanks, Milton. I agree very much with Jyoti. I think digital my understanding, what I think we can do with digital public infrastructure is to look at it as an infrastructure that can be used to enable digitally powered public services and benefit. And I do think a value-based and narrower definition is a good way of looking at it. Milton, maybe those millions and millions of dollars trillions can come from all that enhanced economic growth you're going to get from your protectionist economic policies in the US in the coming 4 years.
You're going to get deadly losses from that.
But I absolutely am not going to take physical infrastructure off the table, because unless there is internet infrastructure, internet-enabled digital public infrastructure cannot exist. And the other point I want to make is that DPI is not neutral. DPI and how it's rolled out, how people experience it, will be shaped by the context. An authoritarian regime is going to use DPI to enhance control. A revenue collection-focused regime is going to use it to enhance tax collection. And a public services, public benefit-oriented regime is going to use it to create more inclusion. And I think we cannot take that out of it. In other words, DPI is not neutral. It's going to rise and fall in how much inclusion there is, how much oversight there is, and how much public engagement there is. But I do think it's an opportunity to come back to looking at what we mean by internet and digital enabled public services, to go back to all those very fragmented initiatives that emerged from open government, from WISs, which are not connecting at all, and which are in most cases not actually creating more digital equality or digital inclusion. And I think we can use DPI to bring that conversation back to how do we collaborate, how do we integrate to achieve actual benefit for people.
Thank you, Andrea.
Few ideas. First, regarding the cost, you did mention very often the cost. I think that Luca was right to say there is a difference between physical infrastructure and digital public infrastructure. The difference is that basically, first approximation, digital infrastructure are non-arrival goods. You can have a lot of uses without scaling the cost. Of course, you have to pay the servers, etc. I was very impressed in India because basically the cost of Aadhaar is $1 per person. The cost of the French and most European IDs, digital IDs, is $100 by person. So that's not so expensive. And the cost of UPI. So UPI did allow more electronic transactions than US plus China together. And that's basically a set of APIs plus a governance body. That's such inexpensive. So the question you did ask, what should be done now? First, like Luca too, I'm not sure we have a very precise, unified definition for everything. And we have various national approaches. But probably what we should look for should be the minimal viable infrastructure that protects the free internet, the free market, real democracy. And if you thinking like this, you can find some answers. And for example, Jyoti, you did ask, should social network be a DPI? I don't think so. But I think that curation algorithms should. we should impose a market with a diversity of curation algorithms. We should not let 3 billion people access to information through one algorithm designed by Mark Zuckerberg, because that's not democratic. So we should use the API movement to impose a variety, to degroup, to impose a variety of algorithms, thanks to one app store for algorithms that social networks should have to agree to accept. And we should start learning to think like this. What should be the minimum infrastructure to protect the free internet, to unleash a free market, and to protect democratic feedback? And when you start thinking like this, you find sometimes some, maybe not answers, but propositions of answers.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll go to Loka next, and again, action items, if you can.
So again, I think that there are drawing conclusions from what we have discussed and from what I was trying to convey. There are multiple layers that we should consider in this quite complex situation. First, we should not think that DPI is bad or good, but analyze how it is proposed and how, I'm speaking about the how it emerges as a discussion, because I'm very concerned, for instance, that now IMF is imposing digital identity as a counterpart for having loans, because this is an imposition. It is not something that is emerging as a bottom-up process from the country that wants to develop it and knows how to develop it, but it's been imposed and likely adopting another type of technology that does not necessarily fit the specific reality. So you were speaking about Visa and MasterCard being part of the US, let's say, ecosystem that may work very well in the US. But we have also to acknowledge that, I don't know, I'm not an expert in the US, I am admitted, and it's not a country I study too much, but every country is very specific. So there is no, first, there is no silver bullet. So if we cannot impose, that is probably the reason why the ITU GovStack does not work very well, because we cannot impose or hope that everyone will magically adopt a fantastic solution. It's much better to bet on the fact that those who are ready and want to do this might be able to develop it. And here, my second point, institutions that drive this process are very important. The Brazilian example, I want to stress this, is very special example driven by an institution that, although it is in an emerging developing economy, it's very well resourced, has very good command and control capabilities, and understands systemically how to do this. And they show that the PIX system is a success because they've understood all the layers of complexity, starting from the access, meaningful connectivity, or the lack of meaningful connectivity in Brazil. Because the reason why they postponed WhatsApp payment is because they are well aware that Brazil is not meaningfully connected. 22% of the population has meaningful connectivity. 78% of the population is connected only through WhatsApp and Facebook. So that is a very important point, because if we are investing a lot of money in a digital public infrastructure and everyone will only use Facebook and WhatsApp, we are wasting our money. So we have to think systemically. And last but not least, I think that this also gives a lot of hope to those who have been over, like some of us, for 15 or 20 years speaking about multi-stakeholderism. It's a very good example of how multi-stakeholderism can go beyond nice chats in exotic places and being very outcome-oriented and effective when it is well orchestrated.
So more bottom-up, where it's ready, no top-down.
Understanding the local realities and engaging the stakeholder in the most effective way.
And good, but recognizing that when things evolve in that way, they tend to could be fragmented, right?
Yes, but in this, I mean, they could be fragmented, but if we cannot think that to fight against fragmentation, we impose concentration and accumulation of wealth by only 3 or 4 enormous tech companies that actually are not even taxed as they would be. So if you want to find the money to buy all this, start to tax Google, Facebook, Meta, Amazon, that have reaped enormous benefits since the pandemic, that have never been taxed properly. I mean, there are enormous reports about only Brazil, India, and Indonesia lose $4 billion per year in tax evasion. So if you want to find the money, let me tell you, my friend, you can find it.
4 billion might finance the broadband in what, 2 cities? But anyway,
But
David,
I'm not speaking about broadband. I
David.
speak about software. It's
Okay.
much cheaper, as Henry was saying.
Yeah,
David, you're on.
sure. I think a bottom-up approach will give I mean, there are already key players here that kind of control most of the environment, so they will effectively control more of the environment if it's only bottom-up. So I think regulation needs to be there, some institutions, but also with I know that ITU libraries and so on may not be fully used as was hoped by some, but I really do like the idea that we have libraries with open standard source code and so on that can be used, because that also drives innovation and ensures that the civil society, but also the private companies, can look into what's happening at the public sector side, so that the government kind of don't take control of all of the relevant infrastructures, because I think to develop an inclusive digital infrastructure needs to be cooperative between the public and private sector, but also needs to be transparent and ensure that everyone with skills can go in there and look what's actually happening. And also, I was surprised that India have excluded their public sector from the data protection side, because that is one thing that I think is working quite well in EU when it comes to ensuring kind of transparency and openness of the data, which is of course what's the most core to people, their data or data about them. So I would say regulation and kind of openness and providing like tech stacks for everyone to use, and then we will have some players or some areas or nations that will go before the other ones, and hopefully they will do a good job so that the other ones can kind of jump into that train and then we can see kind of interoperable basic infrastructures that people can build up using their kind of natural context to that, and that in itself I hope would enable people to travel more freely, both digital and physical, using the kind of own controlled digital identity, which is the key enabler for most of these things.
Okay, so I just realized that I've totally excluded the audience from the discussion. It's because so much vigorous stuff was going on here, but it was hard to get in, and I'm sure we'd be talking for another hour if I didn't rein them all in. So I would encourage you that if you're here to approach the speakers, take off your headphones and talk to people about some of their ideas. I think we have about 5 minutes.
Minutes.
We have 8 minutes.
7.
7 minutes.
Let's unleash the audience.
All right, here we've got somebody. You'll have to give him a microphone.
Thank you very much. My name is Kashfi Inua from Nigeria. Quite insightful and interesting conversation. But my question is, why is it's only in the global south we talk about DPI? In the global north, nobody talk about DPI. And looking at how they evolve in terms of building the infrastructure, it's really most what is happening in the enterprises. By having a backbone, and through that backbone they are connecting everyone. So sometimes I just getting confused. Always talk about DPI Global South. Thank you.
So first, I don't think there is such thing as a global south. There is a huge diversity in the south and in the north. But I work on this question for a long time, your question, because so the truth is, as it was said, we have most ancient and complex systems that is working a bit like a DPI. For example, in France, you can buy a baguette with your credit card without paying any fee to anyone. So you don't really need UPI because you have this system. But our system is very ancient, with a strong legacy, very expensive, but the need to change is not the same. But as I said, you have X-Road in Estonia, you have France Connect in France, you have pieces of DPI, but they were designed before the DPI movement.
Luca?
Just a quick comment on this, because I think that the Global South has realized that there is a problem. We have been digitally colonized, and I think that the only thing that is in common in the Global South or the global majority, they are extraordinarily diverse countries, but the only thing they have in common, they have been colonies. So they understand when they are colonized again. The global north is used to be the colonizer, and they are not being used to be colonized. Now they are realizing it now. Let me tell you, I was at the European Parliament in September to present the research on digital sovereignty in the BRICS, because now the global north is studying the global south, because there are a lot of things to be learned from India, Brazil, China, South Africa, in terms of how to react to this kind of digital colonialism that is of course ongoing, and from which very few countries, I would say only one, is benefiting, and the others are not benefiting at all. So the others have a problem and need to find a solution.
I would want to
Just
challenge.
Simply, you are right. We speak about it in the Global South because we don't have infrastructure. You don't speak about it as much in the Global North because you have infrastructure. I mean, you know what it feels like to go to the Netherlands and they complain that their trains are late. You know, when in South Africa, getting a bus is impossible. You know, so it's a vast difference. And I think that the sad thing is that these conversations replicate during the structural adjustment era when we were trying to invest in public education and public health. We were told by the international financial institutions and the global north, don't let the market do it. When we talked about building broadband capacity, we told by Milton and other people, let the market do it. The market fails to do that. I'm not saying the market is to blame for that. I think there are a whole set of complex factors. But so that's why we keep having these conversations. And I think the challenge is, are our governments having them in the right way, in the most effective way? Are financial institutions responding in the most effective way? But I think it's very clear why we have these conversations. I think we just need to use these conversations better, be more action-oriented and more context-oriented in how we actually try and redress these gaps in infrastructure that we are talking about.
I don't think any of you actually answered his question, which was like, I mean, partly you did. You're saying,
I think
yeah, we don't have infrastructure. None of you have dealt with the question of why they don't. Now, part of it is the legacy of colonialism, and by that I mean real colonialism, not this fake thing called digital colonialism, in which you're simply talking about the advancement of technological capabilities and their extension from the leading countries. But a lot of it is also the fact that your institutions have not allowed for the market development that is possible in other countries, right? You have telecom monopolies still in many African countries, still state-owned telecom monopolies. You have, you know, it's illegal to have voice over IP in many of these countries for a very long time. All the forms of competition and innovation that were enabled by digital technology have frequently been stifled by extremely authoritarian or protectionist governments that will not allow the infrastructure to develop.
I just like to jump in here. I think Yoti has something to say, but I was also going to direct my next question to you, and it builds off of this if you'd like to just take that. I think what he is trying to say and what you were trying to say about the Global South differences, I think what we actually have to acknowledge and what we publish in our own research is that these are places called leapfrog regions and that they exist in the Global North. You can look at Flint, Michigan. You can look at different parts of Atlanta, New York. There are regions that when COVID hit, we saw that there was not digital public infrastructure in the North as well. And so we need to acknowledge that digital public infrastructure does go across both sides. And so my question would be, I think, when you talk about authoritarian governments and monopolistic telecoms companies, I think what we feel in the Global South is that those companies and that structure is not structured by our governments, it's structured by outside forces. And so what can we do as parties in the Global South? Like, I come from Northern Ethiopia, he comes from Nigeria. I'm not sure where you come from, but you know, but I think what I'm curious about to hear, and Yoti, I'd love to hear you start off, is how do the youth from these places, how do we decide to, like, we'd like to take control of our own infrastructure, and how do we leapfrog past what we see in front of us, because it's highly, highly unfair?
Jyoti, want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you for these amazing questions from the audience. And I have a very skeptical view of this. To the first gentleman's question as to why we hear this label more from Global South and not so much in Global North, is because the label has actually been developed in the Global South. And, you know, these advanced nations with their advanced technological capabilities are you know, wary of adopting terms that they have not been involved in directly right from the outset, been dictating terms of their development. So it's like, it's a little bit coming from geopolitical competition around tech policy, but also, you know, people are wanting to see how this label evolves, what is the impact, and then when they see it is a great success. So to Luca's point, why Gates Foundation or the IMF are now suddenly using these labels once they pick up, once they become popular, and they see the benefits of these labels, they will start using it more. In terms of how do we leapfrog, I want to give an example from India on broadband, actually. So
Jyoti,
when Reliance,
we're about to get kicked out of the room. It's 11
2
o'clock.
seconds. So Reliance brought the data rates completely low in India, and everybody clapped and said, this is wonderful. But now, 10 years down the lane, we see that the investment in actual internet infrastructure has dwindled down because there's a monopoly, or there are only 2 telecom operators in India. So we have to take these decisions carefully. There are always trade-offs involved, and I'm happy to discuss this offline. I don't want to hold anyone in the room. But thank you again for the questions and for all your inputs and for making the time. And to all the panelists and the speakers, thank you again very much for being a part of this.